time, union bosses are demanding that ministers act decisively to clear up rules on gender identity in schools. That's because secondary school teachers have been left fearing disciplinary action for denying children their rights. All of this comes after a pupil in Scotland told their school that they want to identify as a fox. Joining me live is child therapist and expert on species dysphoria, Saskia Joss. Hi, Saskia. Thanks very much for joining us this afternoon. So there's been a lot of press coverage about this. Children who identify as cats or dogs, now a child who identifies as a fox. And I think people's first reaction is either to laugh or to dismiss it as a sort of childish fantasy. You know, they remember maybe galloping around the house when they were kids pretending to be horses, or, you know, wanting to eat out of the dog's bowl. They think it's a kind of light-hearted flirtation with a silly idea. Or to suddenly get very annoyed about it because they think, you know, a child is a child, not a cat, not a dog, not a fox. Stop this child immediately. Absolute nonsense. Woke, liberal. Now, I have discussed this with you before, and actually I was pretty astounded by what you had to say, not to mention very disturbed by what you have to say, because you have encountered this many times in your career, children identifying as animals, and there's nothing funny, silly, stupid, or woke about it. It's pretty much all incredibly worrying and very, very sad. So can you explain why it is that children might identify as a cat, a dog, or a horse?
I would say that children who identify as animals mostly fall into two groups. Children that have been very, very badly affected by usually neglect, some kind of very extreme trauma in their early years. The reason you might think that that sounds a bit extreme, and what am I talking about, is because when children are in a situation where there isn't enough love or care, there are ways that children can learn to cope. And that in this situation might, for example, be a home where the parent is, let's say, on too many drugs to be able to clean the house, cook them any food, cuddle them at night, put them to bed. Children have to survive. We all have this internal survival mode that kicks in because none of us want to die. So one thing that can happen to children who have been very, very badly neglected, and by that I mean who regularly have to eat out of the bin, who are unwashed, who nobody cares for them, no one's checking that they brush their hair, no one's making sure that they're clean at night, that they go to the loo, all those things that you would think are kind of very basic levels of parenting. Children that are not receiving that, who have a noticeably disorganized attachment with a caregiver that cannot look after them, end up in some situations compartmentalizing and deciding it's safer to feel like an animal than a human. If you are a child that has to eat out of the bin, that's terribly traumatizing, embarrassing, disgusting. Your whole mouth would feel like you were eating gravel. But if you had to do it to survive, you'd have to find a way to make it okay. And often it's children who've suffered extreme neglect that end up deciding that they're an animal instead, because survival in terms of a cat eating out of the bin, that's much more normal. It's less disgusting. It's less shocking. It feels less painful, less alone, less tragic for that particular child. And I've worked with quite a few children, cats, foxes, wolves, lots of wolves actually, children who've survived by inherently splitting parts of themselves and blocking off other parts so that they don't have to feel so alone and unloved. And cats are allowed to be alone out at night in the dark. Cats are allowed to eat out of the bin. Cats are allowed to be unwashed for weeks because they don't like water. If you identify as a cat, if you feel truly to survive that being a cat is a healthy way to live, you can get through the most horrendous and horrific trauma. And so often the children that I see, particularly those who've had a lot of neglect, who wish to be an animal or say they are an animal, really have believed it for those early years where they just wanted to survive through traumatic, dangerous, harmful and neglectful parenting.
So therefore, if you're a teacher, a head teacher in any kind of capacity where you're in loco parentis and a child is identifying as a cat, a fox, a dog, a rabbit or any other thing, this is an incredibly serious red flag. It's a warning, it's an alert that there's something very badly awry in that child's life. This isn't a child that's just pretending to be a horse for one playtime at break.
And I would say even let's say you found the child had not suffered extreme trauma, they weren't, for example, adopted because of dangerous childhood circumstances, but they really have been struggling with school, and then they managed to come to school because they feel that they're a fox, let's say. It's a niche one, it doesn't happen all over the place, but it seems to be happening more because children are more allowed to say what they really feel inside, like all of us are now allowed to say what we really feel inside. That In a situation where, let's say you've got a child who out of nowhere, they haven't said it since they were young, it isn't something everyone's always noticed about them, but suddenly they come to school and they say, I actually can only come to school if you believe that I'm a fox, let's say. What they're really saying is, I'm nervous, I'm anxious, something about coming to school is just distressing me. And I've had to find a means to survive this experience of going to school. And if I wear this costume, if I wear this feeling, if myself feels like a fox, I feel brave enough and empowered enough to be here. And so obviously for teachers, this is very difficult. They haven't had medical training, mental health training, split, kind of children who've got split sections of their alternate personalities, things like that you might encounter in a job more like mine. And they're being asked to deal with those things without any extra training. And that's where the issue comes in. And I think there are ways in which we can manage these children very, very safely, understanding that either it comes from a place of great trauma or great anxiety, in the same way that a child might, for example, buy a Superman costume when they're 4 and then not really want to take it off for a few months. It's quite a similar process. It makes the child feel empowered. It makes the child feel more themselves, safer, more in control. But why would we deny that from anyone? Why would we stop anybody from feeling safer and more in control?
So here's the question. So these professionals, including parents who aren't professional, haven't been trained in this. They're not expecting this. They're not expecting a child saying, I'm only going to woof at you today. I'm not going to, and I'm going to spend the whole lesson sitting on the floor and, throw me a bone at lunchtime. They're not going to be expecting that at all.
No,
are they supposed to, is the right thing to treat that child as a dog that day or forever, or what?
So it really depends on the situation. And obviously, we can't talk about every single child and all the trauma that any child has been through. But my suggestion would be 2 things. Number one, to ask the child what it is about being a cat or a fox or a fish or whatever it is that makes them feel happier and safer, and what they feel without it. What's the difference when they're not allowed to be a cat, when they're not allowed to be that person, that animal self? What is it about themselves that feels like it's missing? And if it's a feeling of security, safety, love, the school needs to be trying to make the place feel safer and more loving for that child. Could they have a key person in the school that knows about their personality and helps them to manage at school? Could they be allowed to eat or work in a separate place if they have to make animal noises, for example, to survive it, to feel like they're managing themselves with their coping strategies that are very irregular and out of the usual, but work for that child? Are there ways we can manage that? So I think the other thing we'd be saying is, for example, we understand that you feel like you're a fox. We get it. You've had a difficult time, or this makes you feel empowered. But how can this fox correctly attend this school? So there are rules for this school. For example, everybody does homework. So if you can be a fox that does your homework, we've got no problems here. If you need to sit on the floor, we don't really mind, as long as it doesn't disrupt the other children. If that's where the fox sits, as long as you're doing your work, you answer your questions when we ask you, and you make sure you're here on time like everybody else. If you're following the school rules, we can identify ways to make you feel safer. So either you don't have to be a fox or a cat all the time, you can be one sometimes when it feels like you need your safety blanket, your safe experience from your own life. Or maybe you can just be a fox or a cat that complies with rules. And if we give you the respect that this is part of you and an important safety mechanism inside yourself, then you can give us the respect of being a compliant member of the school. And that's when, in the place of respect and understanding and care, children can, if they are suffering with different personality structures, integrate because they finally feel safe enough to not need their cat personality.
One final question for you, which is this. This identifying as a cat or a fox has been enormously, particularly in the media, conflated with I'm a girl but I identify as a boy, I was born biologically a boy and I identify as a girl. So it's been mingled up with and mixed up with gender identity, this idea of identifying as a cat or a dog. It's the word identify that's really kind of the bridge between the two things. But I would suggest that the two are not related or connected in any way at all. And I wonder if you think it is misleading and deliberately controversial and incredibly unhelpful to conflate the two things when they're not the same at all in any way.
I agree. I think the issue is that when it sounds like people are identifying as things that even are things we'd never heard of before. So previously, people have found it difficult to struggle with the idea of being non-binary or having a difference in feeling of your own gender dysphoria, that your gender doesn't suit you, and being your own gender makes you feel unwell, unhealthy, makes you suicidal. That's been a very confusing concept for people who don't feel that way. And that's why it's always been complicated. People feel anytime people introduce something that people haven't heard of before, isn't their life experience, people do feel the need to push against it and say, well, that's not me, I don't like that, don't do that. And actually, this is not the same thing. And also, it's not really the same, but they're not the same, but neither need to be pushed against. As long as everyone is helped to feel safe and as themselves, it's none of anybody else's business. As long as we comply to social rules and we help each other do the things we need to do every day, like children going to school. If they can go to school as a non-binary person or a cat, it doesn't really matter as long as everyone's safe. But this is not the same thing. Usually children who identify as animals, they wouldn't say the word identify. They would say, I am a cat. I'm not identifying, I've not become a cat. I actually am a cat. This part of me that protected me all these years is an actual self inside me. This cat is myself. It's not that I'm identifying or getting dressed up as a cat. It's not the same thing at all. It's a sort of internal working model that's allowed those children to survive the most disgusting and dark days that most of us are lucky enough that we would never even think about them, let alone experience them.
Thank you very much indeed, because this is something very complicated that's been portrayed, I think, very inaccurately and most unfairly in the media. And you've done a great deal to, I think, shed some light on it and illuminate and elucidate something that's actually very sad, very worrying, very personal, and needs to be handled with great delicacy and care. Appreciate your joining us on the show, Saskia. Thank you very much.